Well, good morning. Very happy to be back here in Seoul, a place where people always seem to be interested in what we do, in my country at least. Today, I'm going to talk about how it is that we did become what Estonia is today in terms of, well, it's considered one of the most digitized countries in the world. I know that Korea is the most wired country in the world, so we may not be the most wired, but we're the most digital. We'll try to figure out what the difference is through my talk, and the gist of my talk will be basically, oh, we got there already. All right, let me tell you about what we are, just so you understand. We are a small country, but 90% of the country uses the internet regularly. 88% of households have their own computers. More importantly, virtually everyone in the country has an active digital ID card. I mean, there's a little more statistics. Some of these are even getting old. The key one here is that we calculate through the amount of time saved that that digitization gives us an extra 2% a year to our GDP, and that is actually the relevant thing for us. We have basically virtually all services in my country are available digitally, to the point that there are only 3 interactions between the citizen and the state that you cannot do online, where you have to show up yourself. First of all, you have to show up somewhere at an office or when you get married. Secondly, less pleasant, you have to show up, both of you, when you get divorced. And then third, if you want to sell or buy property, you have to show up. And in terms of corporations, a board member of a company that buys property must show up. This is something that, this deals with a problem that is quite extensive in places like London, New York, Miami, where anonymous shell companies can, in the United States and in the UK, buy property, leading to all kinds of strange results if you know what's going on in London, New York, and Miami in terms of various mafiosi from various countries buying property. Importantly for us, while we're a small country, 7% of GDP is produced by, in the IT sector, but the number of people working in the IT sector is 0.3% of the population, which gives you an idea of how much that brings to us. And you can see the average value per employee, that's including everybody in the IT sector, is 45,000 euros per year, which is basically, well, so 52,000 US dollars. What makes me very proud is that while the European Union considers us, I mean, the European Commission has rated us and thinks that we're by far the best, have the best digital government, and the UN thinks we are the most secure in terms of cybersecurity. But these figures change all the time. But for me, the most important one is the second one from the left on the bottom, which is actually now we're back to being #1 as the country with the greatest number, the largest amount of freedom on the internet. Putting these two facts together, most secure and #1 in internet freedom, shows you that you do not have to buy into this lie that you have to give up freedom in order to have security, which is something that you hear various countries maintaining. We don't do that. Basically now, to look at what I will talk about, and crammed into this brief time, is that digitization these days has very little, if at all, to do with money or how much you spend on it. Yes, there are certain investments you have to make, but how do you account for the fact that so many very rich countries are really behind digitally? Why is it that a country like mine, which before was very poor, suddenly, or over a period of time, becomes one of the most advanced? It's something you can't buy. It's political will that you need in order to digitize a society. If you have the political will, you'll develop a policy. When you get the policy, you create the legislation, and once you have that, you can do the regulation that you need. Basically, what I would say that Estonia comes down to is solved in its own way the fundamental issues that face digitization of society. First of all, you have to have a secure identity. On top of having a secure identity, in order to do all the things you can do with a digital economy and a digitalized country, you need to give that identity legal force. What does that mean? It means that you basically you can sign documents legally with a digital identity. Secondly, you need a secure architecture, and I will talk about the architecture we use in Estonia. And third of all, you need to solve the problem of the integrity of data. This is where the term blockchain comes in. Everyone is crazy about blockchain, probably saying blockchain because it begins with a B, as does Bitcoin. So I prefer to use the term distributed ledger, which is the same thing as blockchain. But the point is that when you start having huge amounts of data, personal data, then you need some way to maintain its integrity. Everyone seems to be concerned about privacy. Privacy is an issue, yes. Privacy is, say, someone finding out what my blood type is. I may not be happy if someone finds out my blood type or they publish it. On the other hand, data integrity is someone changing the record of my blood type. And I think that the world has or at least sort of liberal democracies have worried too much about the privacy problem without paying enough attention to the data integrity problem, which I maintain is far more important, because you do not want people bad actors changing your personal data, or any data actually. So this is what we have created over the past 30 years actually, is a system that uses existing standards, open source, non-proprietary software, Linux-based. We have a key element is that whatever the government has done, it has almost always done it together with the private sector, because the private sector has figured out that it is very much in their interest. The infrastructure that we use, after all kinds of trial and error, we've set up in 2001 already, and has been all of what I talk about has been in place. Most of it has been in place more or less at the infrastructure level since 2001, and all services that we have, both public and private, hook up to these services, so it's easy to do. Why did Estonia, a poor country, do this? Very briefly. In 1938, which was the last full year before World War II, Estonia and its northern neighbors, its cousins, the Finns, we share a very strange language, more or less. We had identical GDP per capita. 1992, after 50 years of Soviet and Nazi occupation, our GDP per capita in 1992 was, as you see, basically $2,800. And the GDP of Finland was 22,000 US dollars per capita. What does that mean? Well, it means we had 50 years of lack of development, and so therefore we were in bad shape. Why were they ahead, at least from our point of view? Well, we looked at what do the Finns have? They have Nokia, their famous mobile phone company that everyone in the US thought is Korean, but anyway, probably because of the Kia in there. But that was the Finns in the 1990s. This was my country in the 1990s. And unfortunately, only about a third of the people in the country had even that. So what do you do if you're a country like in bad shape, as we were? I mean, there are all kinds of different ideas, and I'll speed up this part. Basically, it looked bad. we are 50 years behind, even if we started catching up dramatically. It's like Zeno's paradox, if you know, sort of Hercules running after the turtle's still always a little bit ahead. So for me, I started pushing digitization for two reasons. One, I thought it was a good idea anyway, because 50 years ago, I was a 14-year-old in a little school in the US, and I had a math teacher who decided to do an experiment. She was doing her PhD in math education at Columbia, and she taught us how to code or to program in BASIC. So in 1969, we had a teletype, a perfo tape, hooked up with a big telephone modem to a mainframe 50 kilometers away, and we learned BASIC. And the big moment of my life was successfully programming or printing, having the computer print y equals x squared. And it was just amazing seeing that. Probably go up there. And so I learned to program then. This came back to me much later in life when, well, we were all Estonians were sitting around, how the hell are we going to come out of this because we are so far behind. But what happened, at least what I saw, was in 1993, you got Mosaic. And this was the first web browser. It was 4 years after Tim Berners-Lee invented the HTTP protocol, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is the basis of the internet. And I looked at this and I said, wow, this is great. First, we had to go buy this back in those days, and you had to load it with upload it with floppy disks. But the point of this is that this was the first web browser. There had never been anything like this. And I looked at this and I said, we're starting on the same level as all of those big guys. The US, Germany, Japan, Korea, they're all much richer than we are. But when it comes to digital stuff, we're all in the same place. And so I started pushing this with the government. Fortunately, the government listened to me. I didn't have any political position at that point. And so what I said was, why don't we just digitize all the schools, put all the schools online, have computers in all schools. We had this program called the Tiger Leap, and we got everyone, all schools online by 1997, 98. This was so successful that then the next idea was, which was also strongly supported by the banks, was to get everyone else online, if not with their own computers, because we were very poor, but then let's put in every municipality, every village, in the libraries, in the schools, let's have times open for people to use computers, and let's go teach people how to use computers. The banks, this is the beginning of the banks really being interested in this program because they realized that with a country full of brick and mortar banks in every tiny village, it would be too expensive for them to continue. So why don't we digitize these services and have people bank online? And so then we came up with this program here, which was See the World, and we went around. I remember I was even foreign minister, but I would go around occasionally on these bus tours of rural areas, showing older people how to do stuff online. But it became clear by the end of the 90s that since we were on this path, that there were fundamental issues we had to resolve. This is the most fundamental issue that plagues everything to this day. 80% of hacks today are not, they're not sophisticated backdoors, zero-day vulnerabilities, any of those things. It all comes down to basically not knowing who's trying to get into your system. The US election was probably decided by a few people who made silly mistakes with letting people into the Democratic National Committee server, because through spear phishing attacks, the Russians basically got into the servers and got all of Hillary Clinton's correspondence. The same thing happened with the campaign manager, Tony Podesta. Again, he was a victim of a spear phishing attack. And that's because you don't know who you're talking to. So we realized in the early 90s already that we need to figure out the problem of identity, and you do not solve it with the current system or the system that everyone uses, which is an email address plus a password. Any password, already then, but especially today, can be brute force broken. So the fundamental issue is, on the internet, no one knows your dog. This is a classic, famous cartoon from 1993. It has not changed. So what do you need? You need an identity. It has to be unique. It only belongs to you. As I mentioned, you have to make it equivalent to using your identity. You must be able to sign legal documents. I was in Paraguay last year. I'd forgotten to apply for or sign a contract in Estonia, and I got this email saying, if you don't sign this contract by today, you're going to be in trouble. I mean, the contract will become invalid. So I fortunately, there was Wi-Fi. I hooked up my computer. I did my digital signature, and I got my loan. What do you need for this digital identity? You need at least two-factor authentication, which is basically something that, you need to be identifiable securely. You also, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and you also need end-to-end encryption. That is, whatever you do, if you want it to be secure, it must be encrypted in your device, and it must remain encrypted through whatever it goes through until you get to the entity, the person, the agency you want to communicate with. And here, what is the last thing, which is really vital, and it's where the political will really comes in, because most countries don't have the political will to do that. You have to make a digital identity mandatory to have. You don't have to ever use it, but unless you make the digital identity mandatory to have, neither the public sector, your agencies, your ministries, whatever it is, your unemployment agency, your taxation board, or the private sector, the banks, if it's not mandatory, you'll find that uptake and adoption of digital identities in Europe, at least, is about 20% of the population. It ranges between about 15 and 25. Problem is that if you're either the government or a private company, you're going to say, well, that means 85% of the population doesn't have a digital identity. Why should I invest in developing services that use this system? On the other hand, when you have full penetration of society with a digital identity, then it makes lots of sense to invest the money into these developing services, whether you're in government or whether you're the private sector. So the first step in doing all this was having a digital signature law. That is the legal basis of all of this. 2001, we rolled out a digital identity card with a chip on it, which forms the basis of one step of the two-factor authentication. The chip only really verifies that you are you. It doesn't contain other information on it. And then, of course, since a chip is also what is in your phone, we then gave people chips or SIM cards that do the same function. So, in fact, you can do everything on your mobile phone. And now we actually have a new form of identity verification on phones. I won't get into that, but basically, you can do anything you want on your mobile phone, except get married, divorced, or buy property. And then encryption, as I said, is what it is here. Everything from your device to where it's going must be encrypted all the way. This is important. This is important when it comes to two-factor authentication, especially. Two-factor authentication is, in our system, it's your chip and a code that you put in. It can be biometric. I mean, it can be your eye, whatever. Problem with, I mean, the reason why you need to make sure it is end-to-end encrypted is that many banks went off, they said, okay, two-factor authentication is great. We'll send you an SMS. Well, there's a problem with that, and that is that SMS, the S7 protocol, which governs the transmission of SMSs from tower to tower, or from transmitter to transmitter, was hacked. And it has a vulnerability, and it's hackable. So last year, a German bank lost 3 million euros simply because they used two-factor authentication, thinking they were very secure, but in fact, it turned out that they were using SMSs. So you need both, two-factor authentication, and you need end-to-end encryption. And so if you sign a document, it looks like this in my country. And what you need, once you have the identity, is you have to figure out the architecture of this. That is, you have all these ministries, you have all this private sector with all of their data, and you somehow have to connect them all. So what we did was we picked a distributed data, or developed a distributed data exchange layer. We call it the X-Road. The idea behind this is that to maximize security, we don't have a central database. Because as we see from all kinds of big hacks, that if you have a central database, if you get in, then you can get everything. This is not a good idea. Probably, I mean, the worst examples I can think of is the OPM, or Office of Personnel Management hack of all federal employees in the United States, whereas the US government held all of those records in unencrypted, clear text form, and so you could, and it was hacked, because they had all the data in one place, and it was a very poorly designed system, and so now people whoever hacked have for example, the psychological profiles of people who work for CIA. I mean, talking about disasters, that's pretty much of a disaster. Another centralized database was Equifax, which had the personal financial records of 150 people in America. I mean, both of those are unconscionable lapses, but anyway, so the only way you can get into the system at all is through two-factor authentication, verification through a two-factor authentication, which is end-to-end encrypted. The idea behind everything being separate is the same as oil tankers after the Exxon Valdez, which you may or may not recall was the world's largest tanker that ran aground in Alaska, and it was the biggest oil spill in history. That's because all the oil was in one big tank. Since then, people have gotten smart, and they say we put compartments into the tankers, and so if you have a spill, you won't lose that much. But this is basically how this works for us. And I will now show you a very brief video to explain how our distributed data exchange layer works. It's called the X-Road. I hope it works. Should work. Hope the sound works too.
Running a modern state is a data-centered endeavor. Ensuring the functioning of the state requires administering very large quantities of data. Estonia lacks a centralized or master database. Data is stored where it is created. Each agency administers its own data separately, and data is not duplicated. At the same time, state authorities and agencies need data outside their purviews in order to function. For example, the police constantly require information from the population register. Likewise, the unemployment insurance fund depends on information from the health information system. How can authorities securely exchange important data? First, the data must be easily accessible by the authorities that are authorized to use it. Second, the integrity of the data must be maintained. No third party should be able to make any changes to the data while it is in transit. Third, the data must remain confidential during its journey. It must be protected from the eyes of unauthorized parties. The X-Road is a data exchange platform that fulfills all three of these requirements. The X-Road makes life simpler for both the state and the citizens. For example, when a child is born, information about the birth is sent directly from the hospital to the population register. From there, it is sent automatically to the health insurance fund so that the child will have health insurance and a family physician. This prevents the creation of excessive paperwork and saves time. The state functions in the background. The X-Road helps authorities make work processes more convenient. Many activities can be automated, which frees employees to deal with matters that require human involvement. Authorities also don't have to worry about the authenticity of data. They can be confident that data received from the tax board definitely originated from the actual tax board. Additionally, the X-Road can be used regardless of what technology an authority uses. For the state, the X-Road, above all, makes it possible for authorities to efficiently exchange data among themselves. Sensitive information moves securely, and the system itself is so resilient that it cannot be easily brought down by those with malicious intentions. Since the birth of X-Road in 2001, the system has operated continuously without interruption. The X-Road helps the state see the big picture of how different authorities are connected to one another. In addition, the X-Road makes it possible to exchange data not only within the country, but also across national borders. That is, of course, if databases and information systems are working properly. The biggest beneficiaries of the X-Road are, of course, the citizens. They enjoy the benefits of a better functioning state and save all of the time they would otherwise spend submitting papers and forms. How much time? During the time it took you to watch this animation, the X-Road saved around 240 working hours in Estonia. Cool.
Now, what does this give you? This system is in many ways, for at least, this is one example of a system that completely changes 5,000 years of bureaucracy. How does bureaucracy work? Well, how has it worked ever since it was invented, either in China or Egypt or Babylonia or wherever, or in parallel? It's always a serial or a sequential process. You go to an office, you hand in your paper, someone does something with it, looks at it, stamps it, then it goes to another office, and then it goes to another office, and ultimately you get an answer. In this system, it goes out all at once, in all directions, for all of the approvals that are ever needed. So, if you want to register a business, for example, in the European Union, you have to go through all of these steps. Are all the board members, have all the board members paid their taxes? Have any of the board members of the company gone bankrupt? Have they paid their alimony? Do they have speeding tickets? Every one of those is done in a different agency, and so it can take up to a year and a half in some places to register a business. In Estonia, all of these things are done automatically simply by using the identity of the members of the board, their identity, digital identity, and within 15 minutes you get an answer back, because all of those databases are queried and in parallel, so you don't have to wait for some bureaucrat to send the request from the Ministry of Justice over to the Ministry of Social Affairs to check on the alimony part. So governance suddenly becomes far faster if you can do this. One more thing that you get out of this is far greater transparency and automation of various services of governance, because you no longer have the human factor making decisions. Now, there are two kinds of, in broad categories, there are two kinds of corruption. There's the high-level corruption, which basically comes to paying off a minister to get a good deal or getting a contract or a tender because, whatever, you pay the minister. The other kind of corruption, which is endemic in poorer countries, is the first one. you have to pay for someone to do something illegal. The other kind of corruption is where you have to pay a government official to do something that is legal, in fact, something he's supposed to do. There are various terms for these. The best one I've heard, a Greek guy told me, yeah, we have a lot of that. It's called speed-up cash. If you want to get something done, you got to pay him and it gets done faster. Well, the point is that these are all basically things that an official should do. They tend to be non-discretionary tasks. That is, you should get this thing because you are over 65 and you're a pensioner, or you have 3 children, therefore you should get this thing. Or you apply for a permit to build something, and if it meets all the requirements, you should get it without anyone saying, I'll give it to you if you give me some money. Well, since most of these decisions are the kind that you tick off the boxes, have you fulfilled the criteria? Yes, this age, yes, this many children, and so forth. You don't need a human being to do that. All of these data exist in the system already. And so you can find out far better you can process these things far better, and you know when you get something, or you should get, you get it because, in fact, you fulfill the criteria and you don't have to pay anyone any money to do it. This is why countries that have problems like this, I would urge to digitize. For more affluent countries like, say, Korea, the main benefit, I think, comes in from the convenience of something we call, in my country, the once-only rule. The once-only rule, or it's a regulation actually, is that if the government has some bit of data on you, you never have to enter it again. You never have to. If the government knows you live at this address, you don't have to write that in again. If you don't have to write how many children you have on your tax return. All that information exists. We're trying to get this through the European Union now. I don't know whether that'll happen. But here, this is just the difference between serial and parallel processing, which I mentioned that I think is a fundamental revolution that can be enabled by digitization if you do it right. Here are just these are my talking points on corruption. The big one is grand or individual, that's paying something to something illegal. Petty or opportunistic corruption is simply paying an official to do something that he's supposed to be doing anyway. I don't need this. So, all right, I did that. Now, let me get now to the issue of privacy and data integrity and or blockchain. First of all, on the privacy part, one of the hardest things at devising the system that we have is figuring out through regulations who can look at what. Because if you have every ministry, every agency is digitized, well, how do you don't want, I don't think the police should be looking at my healthcare record. I think the Ministry of Justice granting or not granting me permission to build a business should know if I've committed a crime, or they should be able to look at whether I've paid alimony, but I don't think they should be looking at my healthcare records. So figuring out the permissions part is a huge part of a digital society. And this is more complex than you think, and it takes a while. The technical part, as I said, is really easy, and a good example of why it takes time to really do these things. 6 years ago, I proposed to the president of Finland, which had adopted the Estonian X-road system for themselves, and they, like we, have this thing. We have digital prescriptions, so you can pick a prescription up in any pharmacy because it's digital. Is that, well, you have the system, we have the system, why don't we make it interoperable? After all, it's all the same. Now, technically, that would have taken, depending on which geek I ask, a week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, so that it would work across, so a Finnish system would work with the Estonian system. It took 6 years. took 6 years from the president saying, that's a good idea, let's do it, and starting it up until this year, we finally, if a Finn comes to Estonia, and he can go to any pharmacy in Estonia and get his Finnish medicine. It's all regulation. It's all, you want to avoid arbitrage. I mean, the point is you have to be able to pay exactly the same amount of money when you come to my country as you would for the medicine in Finland. But of course, you know, we're different countries. They subsidize some medicines for some people of this age. We subsidize other medicines. To get all of that messiness worked out takes time. On the other hand, those are the kind of things I think governments should do, is figure those things out for the benefits of their citizens. But so the privacy part and the general regulatory part takes time, but we have very clear regulations on who gets to see what. And in fact, we basically have had one violation of privacy that we have uncovered, because since all transactions are logged and we have defined them as being legal or illegal, there was a case early on where a policewoman with systems administrator privileges was caught looking at her boyfriend's records. Now, of course, since she was not authorized to do this, I mean, immediately bells went off, lights went off, and within 15 minutes she was escorted out of the building. She was fired. She was charged with a criminal offense. And the last thing I did before I left was I pardoned her because she felt so bad, because she was just being dumb about doing that. But in any case, these things are highly regulated. As I mentioned in the beginning, data integrity is the other big issue that I want to talk about, because data integrity, once you have a system like this, and you do become highly vulnerable to having people change data, because because you don't have paper records anymore. I'll get to that. Now, a couple of things we've done since we put the system in 2001. We now have, it should be voting. We can vote over the internet. Consistently for the past 7 elections of 10, we get about 31% of the population votes online. E-prescriptions, I mentioned, and they now work at least across one border, the Estonian-Finnish border. E-residency is something we devised because we realized that there are many services that, in fact, up till now, in a pre-digital era, required you to live somewhere, but in a digital era don't. So you can set up a company and not be in Estonia, but you can use the company in Estonia to do business, in which, in the days of Brexit, small and medium-sized British companies love this idea of setting up a company in Estonia, which is in the EU, because they're going to be out of the EU in about 5 months. And then we have data embassies, an issue I'll get to in a minute. This is basically how you vote. This is what a prescription used to look like. This is just a look at where different countries are adopting our Linux-based X-Road system. Now, data embassies is something that this you will recognize is a picture from Fukushima, and as is the next picture, if it comes. That is the reactor. One of the things that is not talked about a lot is that in the process, I mean, as a result of the tsunami and/or this, we don't know which, Japan lost some of their national data in digital form. And this made us worried. We realized, yes, data can be changed, or data can be lost. Now, Estonia is not in a seismically active area, but history, well, in the last 1,000 years, we have been invaded on an average of once every 50 years. 20th century was kind of bad. Here we were invaded 7 times within 1 century. So we worry about what happens with our data. So we decided to do something which I thought was rather creative, which was that based on the Vienna Convention on Extraterritoriality and Diplomatic Immunity of Embassies, we decided to designate a big server, our embassy, in Luxembourg. So all our key data are there. These data, you can see, are all online, in real time, on a server in Luxembourg. Because if we ever get invaded again, all of these things, we want to be able to know who our citizens were. We want to know who's paid their taxes. We want our business registry. We want our Social Security and pension records. We want them all safe. So I would recommend the countries that either are in a seismically active area or countries that sort of are worried about security to actually think about storing their national data elsewhere as well, which of course the big problem is, oh, if you store it outside your country, someone is going to go in there, but in fact, you pick a civilized country that observes international conventions, and then you can just declare your server I'm not done yet. Declare it an embassy. Now, the final issue which I wanted to deal with in the little time I have left is data integrity. When you have all of these things in digital form, and sometimes only in digital form, you have to start getting worried about someone changing your data because you no longer have paper records. For example, our court cases. Our court cases have been digitized since about 2005, but we do not have any paper records of them. So think about it. Your entire legal system is based on laws that are passed, and these are also only in digital form, and based on court decisions interpreting the law. Now, if you go back, and this is only digital, you get into the system and you change a court decision, that will completely alter your legal system. So, what do? Well, you put those key data that are most important to you. What are they? Citizens' health care records, property records, business records, court cases, and laws. You put them on blockchain. Now, blockchain, I prefer the term distributed ledger because it actually describes it somewhat better. And as I mentioned, because blockchain starts with B and so does Bitcoin, people only really think about, oh, this is a way to make a lot of money. Where in fact, from the point of view of the state, you want to make sure people don't change data. We are all going to have to use a distributed ledger system one way or another as we digitize, and everyone will digitize. So it's good to do it early, to think about these issues early, to get your government to put national data, citizens' data, all of the things you consider most important for the functioning of your society needs to be protected through some system that will protect the integrity of the data. We use a private ledger, distributed ledger. That means that there are just a limited number of authorities that were required to sign off on the veracity or the truthfulness of a change in data. And so since there are limited numbers, it's not like blockchain where you have to wait for a long time for someone to get all the approvals of all the millions of people who are on that blockchain. But do think about it. So anyway, to sum up, if you want to digitize, the problems to solve are fairly simple. They're not easy to solve, but it comes down to legal decisions, governmental decisions on identity, on architecture, and integrity. And if you solve that, you're way ahead of most countries. And there aren't many countries that have done this. And I would say that if there is a country that could pull it off, because you've already done so much yourselves, it's Korea. So good luck, and thank you for inviting me.